Thank you, Madam Chair, Excellencies, and all participants. So I'm going to pick up on two phrases. First, from Sir John, it's not too late. I would perhaps add the word yet. It's not too late yet. But also, Dr. Kalibata and Tim used the word, it's an opportunity. We have a moment in time here that is critical, that has to be seized. Now, this report doesn't downplay those crises that Tim has just articulated and others. The world is burning. We have new and emerging and old diseases, productivity loss due to soil and water degradation, malnutrition in all its forms manifest now in all countries in the world. What this report seeks to do is certainly not downplay those, to increase attention to the urgency, but to use the latest science, the latest evidence from action on the ground, the latest insights from policymakers and business leaders to get an understanding, as Tim laid it out, of how food systems lie at the core of these many different problems. They're interlinked. They are, of course, the tip of a very fast melting iceberg, but we have to embrace that complexity. This is not a single problem. That said, if we better focus in on the role of food systems, both as part of the problem, but more importantly, part of the solution, then we do have a major opportunity to act in ways that can prevent the worst from happening. That is what this report is largely about. The problem statement I'm not going to dwell on. Where we talk about food systems, at the end, we're not just talking about production. We're talking about the whole food system from production through to consumption. So dietary choice by the consumer, by what is sold in supermarkets or on farmers markets, what is eaten is a manifestation of the food system, but suboptimal diets around the globe are responsible for a significant amount and a growing amount of premature mortality that could have been prevented, both on the side of undernutrition, but also on the non-communicable disease side, stroke, heart disease, and so on. And this is not a rich world problem alone. Low and middle income countries are facing this already, and the effects in those countries is growing rapidly. The burden of diet-related diseases in low and middle income countries, just for diabetes, is astronomical. And the effects on individuals or household budgets, but especially on health budgets and national government budgets going forward in resource-constrained settings is quite striking. Something that we have to take into account. At the same time, we cannot forget the existing and persisting problems of undernutrition, which means we have to think about malnutrition in all its forms, which is undernutrition, overweight and obesity, as well as vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And if you just look at children combined who are either not growing well, they are wasted, or overweight in recent years, the problem resides significantly in low and middle income countries, although there are manifestations everywhere in the world. There's no country in the world now that it is immune to problems of malnutrition in some form. Tim mentioned that food systems are a major contributor to damaging the environment through biodiversity loss, water pollution, soil degradation, and of course, greenhouse gas emissions. The latest estimates are somewhere around 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions due to agriculture and land use and forestry changes. Of course, there are estimates around this and error margins, but there is growing convergence of the science of how much what we produce and how we produce it is contributing to the problems of climate change and environmental impacts, to the point of one estimate recently of $12 trillion a year attributable to the cost of poor health, poor nutrition, and failing natural environment due to food systems problems, and rising. The projections out to 2030, 2050 see this potentially doubling if nothing were done. And that was before COVID. Now you overlay the crisis that has overtaken the world in the last 9 months, more people falling into poverty, as Anna Larty mentioned, reversal in many countries of a decade of gains in low-income countries, and more child wasting and otherwise preventable mortality. All of this has been thrown on top of the pre-existing problems and the pre-existing conditions, which have not gone away. What this is doing is amplifying our challenges. The report lays out a series of steps, and I'm not going to go through all the detail. Please look at the report. But a key point to be made is that while many things have to happen together, not one action in one sector, many things have to happen together, that can sometimes seem very daunting, very complex, almost to the point of freezing action, because there are many constituencies, many actors pulling in different ways. The key here is that we have to understand that while it is complex, there are a range of very specific actions in different segments of the food system which can be taken as first steps towards transformation. Transformation can't happen overnight. So we focus on transition. What are the steps that are evidence-based that all governments can focus on to try and move food systems in the right direction? And going around this quadrant, this includes making the right kinds of foods more available. The FAO DG mentioned that there are simply not enough fruits and vegetables and other nutrient-rich foods available. That requires actions to make those foods available. It doesn't mean stop focusing on staple grains and cereals. That has to continue, but we have to make more of the right foods available. Those foods have to be accessible, the second quadrant to the top right, accessible to everyone. And that means making sure that what is produced is not lost and wasted, but it also means ensuring effective storage, processing, transformation, transportation, and taking opportunities for job growth along the food system beyond agriculture. The bottom right quadrant is about ensuring affordability. Anna Larty mentioned 3 billion people today cannot afford a healthy diet as currently available. That means we have to focus on raising incomes through pro-poor growth, safety nets, social protection, carefully moderated taxes and subsidies to rebalance the prices of foods from staples against processed foods, ultra-processed foods against nutrient-rich foods, and so on. All of that has to happen in ways to make the fourth quadrant, bottom left, making healthy, sustainable diets desirable to all consumers. That has to mean the right foods are available at the right price in the right places, but also that people are informed about the role of their food choices. And it's made possible that their shift in demand for dietary patterns then affects the rest of the food system. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail, but just the 4 quadrants. Sustainable, healthy diets have to be available. If you simply think about what the world produces, this is back in 2011, the second of the right-hand diagram. The focus of production globally, and it hasn't changed in the last decade, is primarily cereals and starchy roots and tubers. There's a hefty amount of sugar and production, oils, fats, meats, and relatively fruits and vegetables. There are many ways that we could be eating better. We're not promoting a single diet that is universal for everyone, but there is commonality across healthy, sustainable diet models, which include more fruits and vegetables, relatively less animal source foods and starches, but a lot more legumes and reduced oils and fats. So what has to shift to make more nutrient-rich foods available, including fish, is a rebalancing of agriculture R&D, rebalancing or realigning of the subsidies that go to agriculture sector activities, and a refocus on efficiency, not as optimal profitability, but how to sustain the production of these kinds of foods. Making them accessible doesn't just mean building roads, but it does mean building roads and bridges. Foods have to be moved around. No single country can become entirely self-sufficient in sustainable, healthy diets. We have to understand that year-round accessibility of nutrient-rich foods means protecting those foods, reduce loss and waste, improved approaches to imports and exports. And what we're seeing here in terms of growth of imports and exports, we're seeing quite large growth of imports of foods in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and certainly in South Asia. But not necessarily of the foods that are required to support healthy diets in an affordable way. The FAO State of SOFI report has calculated the 3 billion people currently unable to afford healthy diets. They are actually in all countries of the world, but they are concentrated in low and middle income countries, because purchasing power is low, because the nutrient-rich foods are relatively more expensive or relatively less accessible in those locations. All of those things have to be changed to make affordability a key priority of government policy, and work with the private sector to ensure that those foods are available. And sustainable, healthy diets must be desirable. All of the things that happen down upstream, from production through trade, through processing, through pricing and wholesale and retail, has to be driven by demand. And that demand has to be shifted. What we are seeing over the past decade and a half is a rapid rise in ultra-processed beverages and ultra-processed food consumption in most countries in the world. Interestingly, a decline in ultra-processed drink products in Western Europe and North America, but in the rest of the world, rapid increase. And that reflects demand which has to be better informed, better empowered, not just through information, but shifts in relative prices. The opportunity cost of choice has to be factored in. So important steps in the transition. The global panel does not suggest that this is going to be easy. It's not a simple solution. The political and economic trade-offs are going to be quite considerable. We have to balance short-term versus long-term gains and the winners and losers across different constituency groups, different stakeholders across the food system. But rather than say it's too complex, we have to identify those policy pinch points and address them directly through engagement. The second point is engagement across all stakeholder groups. That includes the dialogues that Dr. Kalibata talked about at the national, regional, local level. There has to be a new vision of what people want their food systems to be and what they do and how they do it. And that means involving all stakeholders in that dialogue and coming up with local visions, plural visions of what can be done. And then thirdly, ensuring that it's not just words. There needs to be accountability, there needs to be defined responsibility, ownership of the steps of the transition, and transparency around the choices made in deciding those steps. Key steps to take without delay. None of this has to be delayed. We don't have to wait for new science. We don't have to wait for 30 years. We have to focus on where policy distortions or there's incoherence in incentives across the food system. Where do they work to counter purpose, and how can they be resolved? How can we reconcile what is done as trade policy or agriculture policy or nutrition policy? Where can we understand how to overcome those and make them work together rather than against each other? We need to seek multiple win targets through multi-purpose policies, because there are so many stakeholder interests, so many constituencies, that actions need to be done not in silos, but in ways that achieve multiple goals. Ideally, improving um, environment and climate change, as well as human health and nutrition outcomes simultaneously. Leverage existing interventions. There are social policy platforms, so safety nets that can be expanded, make more food system friendly through pro-poor growth. There are subsidy systems that can be repurposed to be more sustainable, healthy, friendly. We have to, of course, protect the vulnerable during a just transition. If there are 3 billion people unable to afford the right food today, we have to protect them during a period of transition. Very close to the end, we also realize that while all of this can be done at national level, there are global incentives to act together, but there are also local incentives. What this simply shows is that many different countries across low-income countries, low and middle-income countries, some face high versus low planetary health, climate risks. Some face high versus low human health risks. Some have very low constrained capacity to act. Those are the ones in bold through World Bank assessment of governance indicators. We have to ensure that, that development partners work with their partners in low and middle income countries to build the institutional and human capacity to make these changes real. The key message is that we are all in this together. While the report focuses very much on the needs and the concerns of low and middle income countries, this is a global crisis, a series of global crises that are escalating. The cost and the impacts affect us all. The actions have to be taken by us all, but we have to work on this together. The novelty here is understanding that diets represent a linchpin within the food system. Shifting diets within the food system represents a major possible set of solutions to the human health and planetary health problems simultaneously. These actions are possible. They are incredibly urgent, but we can't let, oh my gosh, transformation is too complex, freeze us and stop us from acting. There are transition steps that key players can take, from civil society through consumers, through businesses and nations. It's daunting. Yes, no one is minimizing the challenge, but it is a challenge that is very much possible. And as Dr. Kalibata mentioned very clearly, and others, we have in the coming 12 months a major set of opportunities to bring these new insights, supported by science, supported by best practice, right to the front of the dialogues around food systems, climate change, and nutrition. We cannot let this opportunity pass. These are times that matter too much for too many people to let it go. With this, I thank you all and hand back to Dr. Larty to take the next steps.